What happens when a man tries to humiliate his ex-wife with his new perfect life? He flaunts his fiancée, a dazzling beauty queen, half his age, thinking he's won the ultimate prize. He believes his ex is broken alone and struggling to pick up the pieces of the life he shattered. But he's about to learn a brutal lesson in karma. Because in the glittering world of the super-rich, secrets are currency, and power is silent. He has no idea that the man funding his fiancée's entire glamorous existence, the billionaire sponsor behind the crown, is the same man who now holds his ex-wife's hand in private. The crystal chandeliers of the Metropolitan Legacy Ball dripped light onto the city's elite, a constellation of old money and new ambition. Victoria Vaughan moved through the crowd with a practiced grace, a ghost at a feast she had once co-hosted. It had been 1 year, 3 months, and 11 days since the divorce was finalized. 1 year since her husband of a decade, Liam, had informed her that their marriage, like a stock that had ceased to perform, was being liquidated. He had taken everything of value, the Park Avenue apartment, with its panoramic views of the city, the Hamptons estate where she'd planted a rose garden with her own hands, and most cruelly their shared history, which he'd publicly rewritten to cast her as the frigid, unsupportive wife holding him back. He'd left her with a modest settlement, designed to be just enough to be legally defensible, but socially crippling, forcing her out of their circle and into what he assumed would be a quiet, suburban obscurity. That's why he chose tonight, this specific event, for his masterstroke of cruelty. Victoria was only here because her best friend Chloe had a +1 on her corporate table. Victoria had almost declined, but a spark of defiance had won out. She wouldn't be erased. She was adjusting the strap on her simple, elegant navy gown, a stark contrast to the glittering couture surrounding her, when a familiar, dreaded voice cut through the murmur of the room. "Well, well. Victoria, I'm surprised to see you here. I thought you'd be couponing." Liam stood before her, a vision of smug triumph. His tuxedo was Tom Ford, his smile was predatory, and on his arm was his latest, greatest acquisition, Tiffany Dubois. She was 23, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes the blue of a Maldivian sea. She was the reigning Miss New York, a title she wore as comfortably as the diamond choker encircling her flawless neck. She was everything Victoria at 36 was not, dewy, pliable, and publicly adored. Liam, Victoria said her voice, a calm, cool island in the churning sea of her emotions. "You're looking well. I'm feeling better than well." He boomed, pulling Tiffany closer. "Darling, this is Victoria, my predecessor." He delivered the line with the casual cruelty of a surgeon, making an unnecessary incision. Tiffany offered a small, rehearsed smile. "It's so nice to finally meet you. Liam has told me so much." Her voice was a breathy whisper cultivated for pageant interviews. "I'm sure he has." Victoria thought the bitterness, a metallic taste on her tongue. She could already guess the narrative, the poor, ambitious man shackled to a woman who didn't understand his genius, now finally free to soar with a partner who matched his brilliance. And this, Liam continued his hand possessively on Tiffany's waist, is my fiancée Tiffany. I'm sure you've seen her on magazine covers. The word fiancée was a gut punch, delivered with precision. Victoria's smile didn't falter, a testament to years of practice in this very social arena. "Of course. Congratulations to you both. Your win was very impressive, Tiffany." "Thank you." Tiffany chirped, her eyes lighting up. "It was a dream come true. I couldn't have done it without my incredible sponsor. He's just the most generous man." Liam's chest puffed out. "I'm the one who encouraged her to seek out the best. Only top-tier support for my girl." "Speaking of which," he said, his gaze sweeping over Victoria's dress with disdain, It's good to see you're managing. Chloe still taking pity on you, I see. Every word was designed to diminish her, to reinforce the narrative that he had ascended while she had plummeted. He was building his new kingdom on the ashes of their life together, and he needed her to be there, covered in soot, to witness his coronation. For a fleeting moment, the old pain flared, the sting of betrayal, the humiliation. She saw the pitying glances from those at nearby tables who were watching the exchange. They saw what Liam wanted them to see, the triumphant ex-husband and the discarded wife. Victoria simply met his gaze, her own eyes unreadable. "Chloe is a good friend," she said evenly, "and I'm doing perfectly fine, Liam. But thank you for your concern." She gave Tiffany a nod. "It was a pleasure. I hope you both enjoy the evening." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away, her back straight each step, a silent act of rebellion against the role he had assigned her. She didn't let him see the tremor in her hands, or the way her heart hammered against her ribs. She made her way through the gilded ballroom, past the champagne fountains and the ice sculptures, and slipped out onto a deserted marble terrace overlooking the park. The cool night air was a balm on her heated skin. She leaned against the balustrade, closing her eyes. He thought he was winning. He had the youth, the beauty, the public adoration. He had his victory. What Liam didn't know, what no one in that glittering room knew, was that the game they were playing was far more complex than he could ever imagine. And he wasn't just losing. He had already lost. Her phone buzzed in her clutch. A simple text message. "Everything all right, I saw you leave." A real smile, the first of the night, touched Victoria's lips. She typed back a reply. "Perfectly. Just needed some air. See you soon." She took one last deep breath, the city lights blurring into a tapestry of diamonds below. Then she turned and walked back inside, not towards Chloe's table but towards the private VIP lounge at the far end of the ballroom, where the real power resided. The VIP lounge was a world away from the main ballroom's performative opulence. Here the lighting was muted, the conversations were hushed, and the air hummed with the quiet confidence of those who didn't need to announce their importance. They owned the building, not just the table. Julian Thorne was standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of whiskey in hand, his back to the room. He was a man who commanded attention through stillness. At 52, he had the lean build of a runner, silver-streaked dark hair, and an aura of intense, focused energy that even his tailored Brioni suit couldn't conceal. He wasn't handsome in the conventional chiseled way Liam was. His power wasn't in his smile, but in his eyes, sharp, intelligent, and missing nothing. He was the founder and CEO of Thorne Global, a private equity firm with a portfolio so vast and diversified, it was spoken of in terms of national GDPs. He turned as Victoria entered, a subtle warmth softening his gaze. He didn't speak, just watched her cross the room, his presence a silent anchor in her emotional storm. "Liam's here," she said, her voice low as she reached him. "With her." "I know," Julian replied, his voice a deep, calm baritone. He gestured with his glass towards the ballroom floor, where Liam and Tiffany were now the center of a laughing, fawning circle. "He's making quite the spectacle." "That's his specialty," Victoria said, a wry twist to her lips. She accepted the glass of champagne a passing waiter offered. "He wanted to make sure I saw them. The happy couple, the victor and his prize." Julian's eyes narrowed slightly, the only sign of his displeasure. "His need for validation is a bottomless pit." It must have been. Unpleasant. It was, she admitted. For a moment. Then I remembered. She remembered the nights after the divorce, sitting alone in the sterile temporary apartment she'd first rented, feeling like a failure. She remembered Chloe forcing her to attend a small private fundraiser for a literacy program she'd always championed. And she remembered being introduced to the event's primary benefactor, a quiet man who listened more than he spoke, whose questions about her previous work with the charity were insightful and genuine. Their connection hadn't been a lightning strike. It had been the slow, steady burn of recognition. Julian had seen past the caricature Liam had painted of her. He saw the sharp mind that had helped Liam strategize his early business deals, the warmth she'd hidden under a shell of self-preservation, and the resilience that was her true core. Their relationship had developed in secret at Victoria's insistence. She needed to heal away from the prying eyes of the world that had judged her so harshly. They met for quiet dinners in tucked-away restaurants, spent weekends at his secluded estate in upstate New York, and built a foundation of trust and mutual respect far from the gossip columns. Tiffany mentioned her sponsor, Victoria, said taking a sip of champagne. She's very grateful to him. A flicker of something unreadable passed through Julian's eyes. The sponsorship is a business arrangement managed through one of my foundation's subsidiary arms. It's a standard contract. Wardrobe, training, travel expenses, and a living stipend in exchange for her representing the foundation at select charity events. Miss Dubois sees it as a path to a crown. I see it as a tax-deductible marketing expense. The cold, clinical assessment was startling, but Victoria understood it. To Julian, Tiffany was an asset, a line item on a budget. His philanthropy was strategic, and the Thorne Foundation's sponsorship of the Miss New York pageant was a calculated move to enhance its public profile. He had likely never met Tiffany in person, more than once or twice at a formal contract signing with a half-dozen lawyers present. The checks were signed by a faceless corporate entity. To Tiffany, her sponsor was an abstract concept, a wealthy benefactor she knew only as Mr. Thorne. She has no idea it's you, Victoria stated more for confirmation than as a question. None whatsoever, Julian confirmed. And it's better that way. It keeps the arrangement clean. The irony was staggering. Liam was parading around his fiancée, whose entire glamorous life, the couture gowns, the celebrity trainers, the Fifth Avenue apartment, was being paid for by the very man who was now in love with his ex-wife. Liam was preening over a trophy that Julian Thorne had bought and paid for. He thinks he took everything from you. Julian said, his gaze fixed on Liam across the room. He thinks he left you with nothing. He turned his attention back to Victoria, his expression softening completely. He has no concept of what true value is. He reached out his fingers, gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. It was a small, simple gesture, yet it held more genuine affection than any of the ostentatious displays Liam was performing on the ballroom floor. In that moment, Victoria felt the last vestiges of Liam's power over her dissolve. The humiliation he'd tried to inflict felt cheap and hollow. She had lost a gilded cage and found a quiet, fortified castle. Julian didn't give her a crown to wear. He valued the one she already had in her own head. Let him have his party, she whispered, leaning into his touch. Let him think he's won. Julian's lips curved into a rare, knowing smile. Oh, I intend to. The higher he climbs on that fragile pedestal, the more spectacular the fall will be. He raised his glass, his eyes meeting hers over the rim. And we'll be watching. In the weeks that followed the ball, Liam embarked on a relentless social media campaign. His Instagram became a curated shrine to his perfect new life. There were sun-drenched photos from a spontaneous trip to St. Bart's, with Tiffany laughing in an impossible-looking bikini. There were glossy shots of them at exclusive restaurant openings, Tiffany's arm draped around him, her engagement ring a gaudy diamond that screamed new money, always angled towards the camera. He tagged Victoria in one of the St. Bart's photos, a picture of him and Tiffany on a yacht, the caption reading, "Finally living the life I deserve with the woman who deserves it all." Upgrade, no regrets. Victoria saw it when Chloe forwarded her a screenshot with a string of angry face emojis. She hadn't followed Liam, but his desperate attempts to get her attention still found their way to her. She deleted the message without a word. Her silence, she knew, would infuriate him more than any response. Liam's world was an echo chamber. He surrounded himself with people who reflected his own self-importance back at him. Tiffany, in her youthful ambition, was the perfect mirror. "Babe, look at this," she said one evening, scrolling through her phone as they sat in the living room of her sleek, minimalist apartment, the one paid for by the Thorne Foundation. "The preliminary budget for the Miss USA pageant is insane. My coach says I need a whole new wardrobe for the appearances in Vegas. So tell your sponsor to cough it up," Liam said dismissively, not looking up from his laptop where he was admiring a fawning article about his latest real estate venture. "I don't know." Tiffany hesitated. "The foundation's manager, Mrs. Albright, is really strict. She said the budget is fixed." "Fixed?" Liam scoffed. "Nothing is fixed for men like that. This Thorne guy is worth billions. Billions, Tiff. Do you have any idea how little this pageant money is to him? It's a rounding error. You need to be more assertive. You're not just some girl. You're an investment. You win Miss USA. His foundation gets a national platform. He owes you. He was coaching her, molding her into a more demanding version of herself, completely oblivious to the fact he was advising her to squeeze money from his ex-wife's new partner. The dramatic irony was a poison, slowly seeping into the foundations of his own life. "Maybe you're right," Tiffany mused, emboldened by his confidence. "I should at least ask for a meeting. If I could just talk to Mr. Thorne directly, I'm sure I could convince him." "Exactly," Liam said, finally looking at her. "Charm him. He's probably some old, lonely guy who gets a thrill out of being associated with a beautiful young woman like you. It's a simple transaction." His transactional view of the world was his biggest blind spot. He couldn't conceive of a relationship, personal or professional, that wasn't based on leverage and what one person could extract from another. Meanwhile, Victoria and Julian continued to build their life in quiet opposition to Liam's noise. One evening, Julian came home to the discreet but stunning brownstone he'd recently purchased in the West Village, a home he and Victoria were designing together. He found her in the half-finished library, covered in paint swatches, arguing good-naturedly with the interior designer. She looked happy. Truly, deeply happy. Her face was free of the tension that had been her constant companion in the final years of her marriage. Later that night, curled up on the sofa in front of a fire, she showed him the Instagram post Chloe had sent her. Julian studied the photo of Liam and Tiffany on the yacht, his expression unreadable. "He's broadcasting his insecurity to the entire world," he said simply. "He thinks he's broadcasting his success," Victoria corrected gently. "It's the same thing for a man like him," Julian replied. He put his arm around her, pulling her close. "Does it bother you?" Victoria was quiet for a moment, considering the question honestly. "The cruelty bothers me. The fact that he's using her as a weapon. But him, no. He doesn't bother me anymore. It's like watching a bad movie you've already seen. You know how it ends." A few days later, Tiffany's request for a meeting with Julian Thorne landed on the desk of Eleanor Albright, the stern, efficient director of the Thorne Foundation. Mrs. Albright, a woman who had been with Julian for 2 decades and knew all his secrets, called him directly. "Miss Dubois is requesting a face-to-face to discuss a budget increase for the Miss USA pageant, she said, her tone dry. She feels her current funding is inadequate. Julian was in his office overlooking the city from 60 floors up. He swiveled in his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips. Liam's handiwork was obvious. Is she contractually entitled to a budget renegotiation? He asked, knowing the answer. She is not, Mrs. Albright confirmed. The terms are explicit. Then deny the request. Politely, of course. Remind her that all communication should go through you as per the agreement. And if she pushes, she won't get far, Julian said. But let me know if she does. I'm curious to see how ambitious she's become. The rejection delivered in cold corporate language by Mrs. Albright stunned Tiffany. She complained to Liam, who was incensed on her behalf, or rather on his own. His advice had failed. His perceived influence was zero. This is unacceptable, he fumed, pacing her apartment. This Albright woman is just a gatekeeper. We need to go around her. I'll have my assistant do some digging. We'll find a way to get to Thorn. Nobody tells my fiancé no. He was a man picking a fight in the dark, unaware he was swinging at a ghost who held all the light switches. And with every frantic attempt to assert his dominance, he was only pulling himself and his beautiful prized fiancée deeper into a web not of their making, but of their own arrogant navigation. The first threads were about to snap. The invitation arrived on thick cream-colored cardstock, the engraving pristine. The annual Heart of the City Gala, a cornerstone of New York's philanthropic season, was honoring Julian Thorn as its Philanthropist of the Year. It was the one event Julian couldn't avoid, the one night he had to step from the shadows into the spotlight. For Victoria, it was a test. Attending as Julian's partner would be their first public appearance together, the end of their carefully guarded privacy. "We don't have to," Julian said, sensing her hesitation. "I can go alone. I can say you're under the weather." Victoria looked at him, at this man who offered her a constant, quiet protection she'd never known. The woman who had fled the Metropolitan Legacy Ball in a silent retreat was gone. She had been replaced by someone who no longer saw the value in hiding. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I want to be there. With you." Liam naturally had secured a table at the gala. For him, it was the premier networking event of the year, a chance to be seen with Tiffany and to glad hand the city's financial titans. When he saw that Julian Thorn was the man of the hour, he was ecstatic. "This is perfect," he told Tiffany, who was in the middle of a fitting for a custom-made Marchesa gown. "This is our chance. We get FaceTime with your sponsor. We corner him, you turn on the charm, and I'll explain why a bigger investment in you is a savvy business move for him. He won't be able to say no to our faces." Tiffany felt a flutter of anxiety. "Liam, I don't know. Mrs. Albright was so clear." "Forget Albright," he snapped, his impatience showing. "She's a nobody. Tonight we go straight to the king. The night of the gala, the ballroom at the New York Public Library was breathtaking." Victoria felt a familiar tremor of nerves as she stepped out of the Rolls-Royce with Julian, the flashbulbs of the paparazzi erupting like a sudden storm. But Julian's hand was a steady presence at the small of her back, guiding her through the chaos with an unhurried ease. She wore a simple, impeccably tailored emerald green dress. She wasn't a beauty queen, but she radiated a quiet, potent elegance that turned heads. Inside, they were escorted to the head table. Liam and Tiffany were seated across the vast room at a respectable but clearly secondary table. From his vantage point, Liam scanned the room looking for his target. He saw Julian Thorn arrive at the main table and gave Tiffany a sharp nudge. "There he is. That's him. Get ready." But then he saw the woman on Julian's arm. His brain short-circuited. He squinted, unable to process the image. It was Victoria. His ex-wife. The woman he'd relegated to a life of irrelevance was sitting at the head table next to the billionaire he was planning to ambush. He felt a hot, prickling sensation crawl up his neck. What was this? How was this possible? He watched as Julian leaned over and whispered something in Victoria's ear, making her laugh. The gesture was intimate, familiar. It was a language Liam had never spoken with her, one he didn't know she was capable of understanding. "What's wrong?" Tiffany asked, noticing his sudden pallor. Nothing, he gritted out his eyes, still locked on his ex-wife. I didn't realize Victoria knew Julian Thorne." His mind raced, trying to formulate an explanation that kept his worldview intact. She must be working for the charity. Or maybe she's friends with his wife. No, he's not married. The most logical, most comforting conclusion he could land on was the most demeaning one. Looks like she found herself a sugar daddy. He sneered to Tiffany, the insult a balm on his wounded ego. Good for her. At least she can afford a decent dress now. Tiffany just stared. She wasn't looking at Victoria's dress. She was looking at Julian Thorne. She'd only seen him once before, in a sterile boardroom, flanked by lawyers. He had been imposing and distant. Now, watching him with Victoria, she saw something entirely different. He wasn't looking at Victoria like an investment or an asset. He was looking at her like she was the only person in the room. There was a tenderness in his gaze, a quiet reverence, that made Tiffany's chest ache with a feeling she couldn't name. It was a look she had never received from her own sponsor, and more painfully, a look she had never not once received from Liam. The evening progressed in a blur for Liam. The speeches, the auction, the dinner, it was all background noise to the roaring in his ears. Every time he glanced at the head table, he saw Victoria and Julian a portrait of effortless intimacy. They weren't being ostentatious. They barely touched. But their connection was palpable, an invisible current that charged the air around them. He saw people approaching their table, senators, CEOs, artists. And they greeted Victoria with the same respect they showed Julian. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't a +1. She belonged there. The planned ambush of Julian Thorne was forgotten. Liam's mission for the evening had changed. He needed to understand. He needed to reassert his narrative. As soon as the formal presentations were over and people began to mingle, he grabbed Tiffany's hand and started making his way towards the head table, a grim, determined look on his face. "Liam, what are you doing?" Tiffany hissed, trying to pull back. "I'm going to say hello," he said, his voice dangerously calm. It's the polite thing to do. He was on a collision course, driven by a bruised ego and a profound underestimation of the woman he thought he'd destroyed. He was about to learn that the game had not only changed, but that he had never even understood the rules. As Liam dragged Tiffany across the ballroom floor, a knot of dread tightened in her stomach. She could feel the stares of other guests. This felt less like a polite greeting, and more like a hostile advance. Julian and Victoria were in conversation with a well-known conductor when they looked up and saw Liam approaching. Julian's expression remained neutral, but Victoria felt a familiar weariness wash over her. Of course, he couldn't just let it be. "Victoria, fancy seeing you again?" Liam began, his voice oozing false geniality. He completely ignored the conductor, who raised an eyebrow and discreetly moved away. Liam then turned his full attention to Julian extending a hand. "Liam Vaughan. I was married to this one for 10 years. He gestured dismissively at Victoria. "I have to say, Mr. Thorne, I'm impressed. She cleans up well when she has the right motivation." The insult was multi-layered and vicious, painting Victoria as a gold digger and Julian as her gullible benefactor. Julian didn't take his hand. He simply looked at it, then met Liam's gaze with eyes as cold and hard as granite. "I know who you are," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying an unmistakable weight of command. The air grew thick with tension. Victoria placed a calming hand on Julian's arm. She looked directly at Liam, her voice devoid of emotion. "Liam, what do you want? I just wanted to introduce my fiancée properly," he said, pulling a nervous Tiffany forward like a show pony. "Tiffany, this is Julian Thorne." Tiffany managed a small, terrified smile. "Mr. Thorne, it's an honor, sir. Your foundation it's changed my life." It was at that moment the world tilted on its axis for Liam. He watched Tiffany address Julian, saw the flicker of recognition and deference in her eyes. He heard her words, "Your foundation," the name on the program, the man of the hour, the billionaire sponsor, the man holding his ex-wife's hand. The pieces slammed together in his mind with the force of a physical blow. Thorne, Julian Thorne, the Thorne Foundation. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a mistake. The money that funded Tiffany's apartment, her clothes, her career, the entire fantasy life he was using to taunt Victoria, was coming from the man Victoria was now with. The blood drained from his face. He felt a wave of nausea so profound he had to grip the back of a chair to steady himself. Every smug Instagram post, every condescending remark, every moment of his supposed triumph replayed in his head, now cast in the horrifying glow of his own stupidity. He hadn't just been posturing for his ex-wife. He had been performing his pathetic little victory dance for the very man who owned the stage, the lights and the puppet strings. He looked from Julian's implacable face to Victoria's calm, knowing eyes. There was no triumph in her expression. No, "I told you so." There was something far worse, pity. She had known. She had known all along, and had let him play out his foolish charade. "You," he whispered, his voice cracking. He was looking at Victoria. "You did this?" This was a setup, a pathetic, vindictive setup. "Nothing about my life is about you anymore." Liam, Victoria said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through his rising panic. "You should probably leave. You're making a scene." He barely heard her. His reality was fracturing. He wasn't the winner. He was the court jester, and the laughter he thought was with him had been at him all along. Tiffany was frozen, her mind struggling to catch up. She looked between the faces, Liam's crumbling rage, Victoria's serene composure, and Julian Thorne's cold, dismissive glare. She finally understood the look she'd seen him give Victoria earlier. It wasn't just affection. It was possession partnership, a shared history she couldn't begin to comprehend. She was a pawn in a game she never even knew she was playing. The man who funded her dreams was in love with the woman her fiancé had tried to destroy. "Let's go," Liam snarled, grabbing Tiffany's arm with bruising force. He turned and practically fled, dragging her behind him. He didn't say goodbye, didn't make excuses. He just bolted from the room like a man escaping a fire. The entire exchange had taken less than 2 minutes, but the fallout was seismic. A murmur rippled through the nearby tables. Everyone had seen Liam Vaughan's bizarre confrontation and his panicked retreat. The city's most powerful figures had just witnessed a public and spectacular unraveling. Back at the head table, Julian finally took Victoria's hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "Are you all right? I'm fine," she said, and she was surprised to find it was the truth. Watching Liam's carefully constructed world crumble didn't bring her joy, but it brought her a profound sense of closure. The ghost of her past had finally been laid to rest. "I think he finally understands." Julian's eyes followed Liam's retreating form. I don't think he's even begun to understand the consequences. He was right. Liam's humiliation was just the beginning. The unraveling had started, and it was about to accelerate into a full-blown, catastrophic collapse. The drive back to Tiffany's apartment was a suffocating silence. Liam's hands were clenched so tightly on the steering wheel that his knuckles were white. Tiffany sat huddled against the passenger door, flinching every time he muttered a curse under his breath. The moment the apartment door closed behind them, the silence shattered. How could you not tell me he roared, turning on her? How could you be so stupid as to not know who your own sponsor was? How would I know? Tiffany cried, tears welling in her eyes. I met him once, in an office with 10 other people. His name is on a paper. You're the one who told me to go after him to demand more money from him. From him. Liam's voice was hysterical. You were demanding more money from my ex-wife's new boyfriend. Do you have any idea how that makes me look? How that makes US look? I only know how you made me look tonight. She shot back, a flicker of defiance cutting through her fear. You dragged me out of there like a piece of luggage. Everyone saw. You didn't care about me. You just cared about being embarrassed. The argument spiraled, a toxic explosion of blame and recrimination. All the cracks in their relationship, previously papered over with glamour and ambition, were ripped wide open. Tiffany saw with devastating clarity that Liam had never loved her. He had loved the idea of her, the young, beautiful, winning accessory. And Liam saw that Tiffany was not the adoring, compliant partner he'd imagined, but a transactional component of a life that had just been proven to be a fraud. The next morning, Victoria was having coffee in the sunlit kitchen of the West Village brownstone when her phone rang. It was Liam. She ignored it. He called again. And again. Finally, a string of venomous text messages began to arrive. You think you're so clever. This was your plan all along. To humiliate me. You probably slept with him while we were still married. You're nothing but a vindictive gold digger. He'll get tired of you just like I did. Victoria read them, felt a pang of the old hurt, and then deleted the thread. She blocked his number. He was a fire she no longer needed to tend to. A far more significant confrontation was happening across town. Tiffany, her eyes red-rimmed and her face pale, had managed to secure an emergency meeting with Eleanor Albright at the Thorne Foundation's headquarters. She was shown into a sterile, intimidating conference room. A few minutes later, to her surprise, Julian Thorne walked in alone. He looked just as he had the night before, calm, composed, and utterly in control. He sat down opposite her, his hands folded on the polished mahogany table. Miss Dubois, he began, his tone professional and devoid of any personal warmth. Mrs. Albright informed me you wish to speak with me directly. This is highly unusual. Tiffany took a shaky breath. Mr. Thorne. I wanted to apologize for my fiancé's behavior last night. He was out of line. He was, Julian agreed, his face unreadable. But I'm not interested in Mr. Vaughan. I'm interested in our business arrangement. I understand you were unhappy with the terms of your sponsorship. The shift back to business was jarring. Tiffany felt like a schoolgirl being reprimanded by the principal. I was misled, she stammered. Liam, he convinced me that I should be asking for more. I never would have. If I had known what Julian asked, his gaze sharp and penetrating. Known that I have a personal life, that my private relationships are separate from my foundation's philanthropic activities. Let me be very clear, Miss Dubois. My relationship with Victoria Vaughan has absolutely no bearing on the contract you signed. The Thorne Foundation entered into an agreement to sponsor a promising candidate for a title. We have honored every clause of that contract. Have we not? Yes. Of course, but you and your fiancé attempted to leverage a business arrangement for your own personal and financial gain. He continued, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. You did so under the assumption that the sponsor was an anonymous, faceless entity you could manipulate. The fact that you now know who that entity is does not change the terms of the agreement. It only changes your perspective. He let the words hang in the air, heavy and irrefutable. Tiffany felt herself shrink under his gaze. He wasn't angry. He was something far more terrifying, disappointed. He was a king dismissing a courtier who had overstepped. "What's going to happen?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Are you going to drop my sponsorship?" Julian leaned back in his chair. "As I said, we will continue to honor the existing contract until its expiration at the end of the pageant season. You will receive the funds you are entitled to. Nothing more, nothing less. Your conduct, however, as well as the public conduct of your fiancé, will be under review. The Foundation has a morals clause, as I'm sure you're aware. It was a threat wrapped in the language of corporate policy. Her future, her crown, her one shot at the life she'd always dreamed of, was hanging by a single fraying thread. After tonight, Julian said, rising from his chair, signaling the end of the meeting, all future communication will be exclusively with Mrs. Albright. I trust we will not need to have another conversation like this. Goodbye, Miss Dubois. He walked out, leaving Tiffany alone in the silent, cavernous room. She finally understood. She wasn't a player in this world. She was a game piece, and she had just been put squarely in check. The reckoning had arrived not with a roar of anger, but with the cold, quiet click of a door shutting her out of the world she had so desperately wanted to join. The fallout from the gala was swift and brutal. Gossip in New York's elite circles moves faster than the stock market ticker, and the story of Liam Vaughan's public meltdown was the hottest commodity. The narrative, however, was not the one Liam would have written. He wasn't the powerful man shocked by his ex-wife's scandalous new relationship. He was the fool who had been unwittingly financing his own humiliation. He became a laughingstock, a cautionary tale whispered over cocktails at the university club and brunches on the Upper East Side. His business began to suffer. Liam was a real estate developer who relied on investors, men and women, who moved in the same circles as Julian Thorne. Suddenly, calls weren't being returned. Potential partners got cold feet. No one wanted to be in business with a man who had made an indirect enemy of Julian Thorne, and more importantly, had demonstrated such colossal misjudgment. His aura of success, so critical to his persona, evaporated overnight. He was no longer seen as a shark. He was seen as a clown. The financial pressure mounted, and with it, the tension in his relationship with Tiffany exploded. The glamour that had held them together was predicated on a limitless future funded by Thorne. Now that future was capped. The contract would be honored, but there would be no more. The dream of leveraging the sponsorship into a Miss USA crown, followed by lucrative endorsement deals and a life of effortless luxury, died. "We need to cut back," Liam told her one night, poring over his bleak financial statements. "This apartment is too expensive. The stylist, the trainers, we can't afford it." "What are you talking about?" Tiffany shot back, her voice laced with panic. "The Foundation pays for this. I need it to compete." "The Foundation pays until the pageant, then what, Tiffany?" he yelled. "The money stops. And thanks to this whole mess, my money is stopping too." Their fights became a daily ritual. Tiffany accused him of ruining her one big chance. He accused her of being a vapid, expensive liability. The beautiful facade had crumbled, revealing the rotten transactional core of their relationship. She saw him not as a powerful partner, but as a flailing, desperate man who had lost his standing. He saw her not as a queen, but as a bad investment that was about to mature into a massive debt. The final straw came a month before the Miss USA pageant. A well-known gossip columnist published a blind item easily decipherable about a certain New York beauty queen whose billionaire sponsor was dating her fiancé's ex-wife. The story painted Tiffany as either a fool or a willing participant in the drama. It was a stain on the wholesome, aspirational image required of a pageant winner. The pageant organizers, sensitive to any whiff of scandal, began to distance themselves. Invitations to pre-pageant press events mysteriously dried up. The positive buzz around her candidacy went silent. Tiffany realized it was over. The crown was an impossible dream now. She had been tainted by Liam's war, a casualty of a battle she hadn't even known was being fought. One evening she packed her bags. The Marchesa gown from the gala hung in the closet like a ghost. Liam came home to find her suitcases by the door. "Where are you going?" he demanded, a fresh wave of panic rising in him. "I'm leaving Liam," she said, her voice hollow. Us. It's not real. It was a fantasy, and the dream is over. You didn't want me. You wanted to win. And you lost. We both lost. You can't leave me," he said the words, pathetic and weak. He was losing his last trophy. "What will people say? I don't care anymore," she said, and for the first time she sounded free. "Maybe I'll go back to school, get a real job. Anything is better than this." She walked out the door, leaving him alone in the beautiful apartment paid for by Julian Thorne, surrounded by the remnants of a life he had stolen and a victory he had imagined. The hard karma had finally hit. It wasn't a dramatic, fiery crash, but a slow, suffocating implosion. He was left with nothing but his own reflection in the panoramic windows, a man who had flown too close to a sun he never even knew was there. He hadn't just lost his fiancée or his social standing. He had lost the only thing he ever truly valued, the illusion of his own greatness. 6 months later, the crisp autumn air swept through the streets of the West Village. Inside the brownstone, the sound of warm, genuine laughter echoed through the high-ceilinged rooms. Victoria, Julie, and Chloe, and a few other close friends were gathered in the living room, savoring the last of the wine after a simple, delicious dinner. The atmosphere was a world away from the stiff, performative gatherings of Victoria's former life. Here no one was trying to impress anyone. There were no hidden agendas, no social ladders to climb. There was just the easy comfort of true friendship. Chloe raised her glass. To Victoria, she said, her eyes shining. "For proving that the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's building a life so beautiful you forget you were ever supposed to be angry." Victoria smiled, a genuine, unburdened expression that reached her eyes. She clinked her glass against Chloe's, then felt Julian's hand find hers under the table, his fingers lacing through hers. It was a small, private gesture that spoke volumes. This was her victory. Not Liam's downfall, but this room, this moment, this man. Later, after their friends had departed, leaving the scent of wine and perfume lingering in the air, Victoria and Julian stood by the large windows overlooking the quiet, tree-lined street. It was then that her phone buzzed with a message from Chloe. It was a link to a Wall Street Journal article. The headline was stark: Vaughan Developments Files. For Chapter 11, Bankruptcy Following Asset Collapse. Victoria sank onto the sofa, tablet in hand, and read the clinical dismantling of her ex-husband's life. The article detailed a cascade of failures, major investors pulling out loans being called in, and failed projects being sold for pennies on the dollar. The final paragraph mentioned the forced sale of his Park Avenue penthouse, the gilded cage he had fought so viciously to win, now just another asset to be liquidated to appease his creditors. He had lost everything. She thought she would feel a surge of triumph, a vindictive thrill. Instead, a profound stillness settled over her. It was the quiet that comes after a long and violent storm has finally passed. She thought of Liam not with hatred, but with a strange detached pity. He had built a life, like a movie, set all gleaming facade, with nothing of substance behind it. When the spotlight was turned off, there was simply nothing there. "He's a ghost now," she murmured, looking up at Julian, who had been reading over her shoulder. A ghost haunting a life that was never really his. "He flew on borrowed wings," Julian said, his voice calm and steady. His currency was perception, not reality. Men like that can't survive in a world that demands substance. The collapse was inevitable. We just happened to be there to see it. Somewhere across town, in a brightly lit, sterile coffee shop that smelled of burnt coffee and disinfectant, Liam Vaughan sat alone at a small table. His suit, once a symbol of his power, now hung loosely on his frame. He scrolled through his contacts, the names of men who once took his calls on the first ring, now just a monument to his irrelevance. He pressed a name, listened for a moment, and was once again sent to voicemail. A man at a nearby table, a junior banker who had once fawned over him at a charity event, made eye contact, then quickly looked away, pretending not to recognize him. The social erasure was complete. He was no longer a player. He was an anecdote. Back in the warmth of the brownstone, Victoria's thoughts drifted to the other person caught in the wreckage. "Have you heard anything about Tiffany?" she asked. Julian nodded, moving to sit beside her on the sofa. "My foundation's director received a letter from her a few weeks ago. She never competed in the pageant. She said the scandal made it impossible. She moved back home to Ohio." He paused, a flicker of something like respect in his eyes. She used the final stipend payment from her contract to pay the first semester's tuition at Ohio State. "She's studying business." Victoria felt a genuine smile touch her lips. Good for her. Tiffany had been a pawn, but she had wisely chosen to knock over the board and walk away. She had extricated herself from Liam's toxic ambition and had chosen to build something real for herself, far from the hollow glamour of a pageant crown. In a way, her journey mirrored Victoria's own, an escape, a retreat, and the beginning of a quiet reconstruction. Julian put his arm around her, pulling her close. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the city lights beginning to glow outside. He eventually led her up to the rooftop terrace, where her small herb garden thrived under the soft evening sky. The victory wasn't the news on her tablet. The victory was this, the solid weight of Julian's arm around her, the scent of rosemary and thyme from her garden, the skyline of a city that was once her prison and was now her home. It was the quiet architecture of a piece she had built brick by brick. He thought power was about being the loudest person in the room, Victoria said, looking out at the endless constellation of lights. He was wrong. Julian replied, his voice a low murmur beside her ear. True power is having nothing left to prove. He was right. She had nothing to prove to Liam, to their old friends, or to the world. Her worth wasn't a reflection in anyone else's eyes. It was a truth she now carried within herself. She had lost a life she thought she wanted only to be set free, to build the life she was always meant to have. And as she leaned her head on Julian's shoulder, she knew this was a foundation that could never be shaken. And so Liam Vaughan's carefully constructed empire, built on a foundation of ego and cruelty, crumbled into dust. He learned the hard way that karma isn't just a concept, it's a debt and it always gets paid. He tried to write a story where he was the hero and his ex-wife was the villain, but he forgot the most important rule: you can't control another person's narrative. Victoria didn't seek revenge. She simply chose happiness. And in the end, her quiet, authentic joy was a brighter, more blinding spotlight than any humiliation he could have ever engineered. Her story is a powerful reminder that the best victory isn't loud and public, but a quiet, unshakable peace built on self-worth and genuine love. What did you think of Liam's downfall? Was it the karma he deserved? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of drama twists and sweet revenge, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with a friend who loves a good story, and most importantly, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Thanks for listening. Have you ever been so underestimated that the thought of your success becomes someone else's nightmare? This isn't just a story of revenge, it's a story of resurrection. It's for anyone who has ever been made to feel small, invisible, or plain. We follow a man, Richard, who publicly discards his wife for a younger, flashier model, believing he's upgraded his life. He steps into the most important gala of his career with his new prize on his arm, ready to conquer the world. But he doesn't know that the woman he broke is about to walk through those same doors, not as a victim, but as a masterpiece. What happens next won't just shatter his ego, it will obliterate the very foundation of his world. Stay with us. Richard Vance adjusted the knot of his silk Armani tie, his reflection staring back at him from the polished obsidian of his penthouse elevator. He was a portrait of success, sharp jaw, a hint of silver at the temples that suggested wisdom rather than age, and eyes that held the cold, calculating glint of a man who always got what he wanted. Beside him, Tiffany preened, her reflection a dazzling counterpoint to his stoic power. Her dress was a cascade of crimson sequins, clinging to her surgically perfected curves in a way that screamed for attention. She was his masterpiece, he often thought, the living, breathing embodiment of his triumph. "Are you sure this dress isn't too much, Ricky?" she purred, though her tone made it clear she was hoping he'd say it was just right. "Nonsense," Richard replied, his lips curling into a thin smile. The Starlight Gala is about making a statement. We are the statement. The gala was the glittering pinnacle of the city's social calendar, a night where fortunes were pledged and reputations were cemented. For Richard, it was more than a charity event. It was a coronation. He was on the cusp of securing a coveted seat on the board of the Vance Endicott investment firm, a position that would solidify his legacy. All he had to do tonight was look the part, powerful, influential, and with the perfect arm candy to prove he was a man at the peak of his life. Tiffany, with her youthful vibrancy and uncomplicated adoration, was that proof. She was everything his ex-wife, Amelia, was not. The thought of Amelia brought a familiar sneer to his lips. Plain mousy Amelia. For 20 years, she had been the beige background to his vibrant life. Her uniform consisted of sensible cardigans, comfortable shoes, and hair perpetually pulled back in a loose, uninspired bun. She was the one who managed the house, raised their 2 now-adult children, and listened patiently to his boardroom war stories without ever offering an opinion of her own. She was comfortable, reliable, and utterly, soul-crushingly dull. He remembered the arguments in the final years. He'd come home, buzzing from a successful deal, and find her hunched over her computer in the small room she called a studio, sketching away on some digital art project. He'd called it her doodle hobby. "Amelia, for God's sake," he'd once said, gesturing at the screen filled with intricate lines and ethereal colors. "Are you still playing with this thing? The Hendersons are coming for dinner. Can you at least try to look like the wife of a senior vice president?" She would flinch, her shoulders slumping as she quietly closed the laptop. She never defended her art, her passion. That was the most frustrating part. She simply absorbed his criticism with a quiet sadness that irritated him more than any screaming match could have. He wanted a partner who mirrored his ambition, who shone under the spotlight with him. Amelia, it seemed, was content to live in the shadows. Leaving her for Tiffany had been like stepping out of a dimly lit museum into the dazzling sunshine. It was, in his mind, a necessary act of self-preservation. The divorce had been swift and brutal. His lawyers had painted Amelia as a simple homemaker with no grasp of their complex finances, leaving her with the modest suburban house and a pension fund he considered laughably small. He'd kept the penthouse, the art collection, the real art, as he called it, and the freedom to build a life that wasn't weighed down by her mediocrity. "I wonder if she'll be there," Tiffany said suddenly, her voice laced with a saccharine venom. She didn't need to say the name. Richard scoffed. "Amelia? At the Starlight Gala? Don't be ridiculous. The tickets are $5,000 a plate. She's probably at home watching television and knitting a sweater. It's where she belongs." The elevator doors opened to the gleaming lobby, the city lights twinkling outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. As the valet brought his Bentley around, Richard felt a surge of triumph. He had it all: the power, the wealth, the woman. He had cut the dead weight from his life, and tonight the whole world would see him soar. He pictured Amelia in their old, quiet house, and felt not a pang of guilt, but a profound sense of relief. She was a chapter he had closed, a book he had put back on the shelf to gather dust. He would never have to think about her again. The quiet house on Maple Street was no longer a place of silent sorrow. For the first 6 months after Richard left, every room had echoed with the ghost of his dismissive words, every corner a reminder of a life she'd meticulously built for someone else. Amelia Vance had drifted through those months in a fog of grief and humiliation. She wasn't just mourning the loss of her marriage, she was mourning the loss of herself. She had shrunk year by year, tailoring her personality, her dreams, and even her appearance to fit into the small, neat box Richard had designated for her. The plain, mousy woman he described to his friends wasn't who she was. It was who she had been forced to become. The turning point wasn't a dramatic explosion, but a quiet, seismic shift. She was cleaning out the small studio Richard had always belittled, boxing up her digital drawing tablet and expensive software, when her daughter, Clara, came to visit. Clara, a sharp-witted law student with her mother's artistic soul and none of her father's cruelty, watched for a moment before speaking. "Don't you dare put that away, Mum," she said, her voice firm. "Dad's voice is in your head. Evict him." The words were simple, but they landed with the force of a revelation. Evict him. Amelia looked at her reflection in the dark screen of her monitor. She saw the tired eyes, the faint lines of sadness etched around her mouth. Richard was gone from her house, but he was still living in her head, rent-free, continuing his campaign of quiet degradation. That evening, she didn't box up her equipment. She plugged it in. She sat down, took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, she drew for herself. Not for a potential client, not as a hobby, but as an act of defiance. What poured out of her was a torrent of pent-up emotion. She created a series of digital paintings, breathtakingly complex and emotionally raw. They were landscapes of sorrow, portraits of resilience, and abstracts of explosive freedom. The style was unique, a fusion of classical technique and futuristic, fractal patterns. She worked for weeks, fueled by coffee and the exhilarating feeling of reclaiming her identity. She created a portfolio, her heart pounding, with a fear she hadn't felt in years. This was hers. It was vulnerable, and it was powerful. What if Richard was right? What if it was just silly doodling? Clara helped her set up a secure, anonymous online gallery under a pseudonym, Aria. "No one needs to know it's you, Mom," Clara had advised. "Let the art speak for itself. No baggage, no history, just Aria." She uploaded the collection, titling it Resurrection, and sent the link to a few obscure art blogs. And then she waited. The response was not a trickle, it was a flood. Within a week, one blog post went viral, then another. The art world was electrified by the mysterious, brilliant Aria. Critics lauded the technical skill and emotional depth. Galleries from New York to Paris sent emails to the anonymous address, begging to represent her. Tech moguls and art collectors were captivated by her unique digital medium. It was a dazed and disbelieving Amelia who found herself on a video call with Julian Croft, a renowned venture capitalist known for his keen eye for disruptive talent in both the tech and art sectors. He wasn't just interested in her art, he was interested in the proprietary software she'd written to create her signature fractal patterns. "Ms. Aria," he'd said, his voice warm and respectful, cutting through her anonymity. "What you've done is revolutionary. This isn't just art, it's technology. I don't just want to buy a piece. I want to invest in you." Over the next year, Amelia, guided by Julian and a team of lawyers, built a company around her software. She was no longer just Amelia Vance, the discarded wife. She was Aria, the visionary artist, and the CEO of a burgeoning tech firm. The money that poured in was staggering, dwarfing the settlement Richard had thought was so generous. But with success came a new kind of confidence. She started working with a stylist, not to please a man, but to find the woman who had been buried for 20 years. The sensible cardigans were replaced with tailored blazers, the drab colors with jewel tones that made her skin glow. She let her hair down, and a top stylist gave her a cut that framed her face and highlighted her high cheekbones Richard had never seemed to notice. She wasn't becoming someone new. She was simply becoming herself. When Julian called her about the Starlight Gala, her first instinct was to refuse. It was Richard's world, the world that had judged her and found her lacking. "I know what you're thinking," Julian said gently over the phone. "But this is different. The Foundation is the primary beneficiary of the auction tonight, and the centerpiece of the auction is Aria's latest piece, the Uncaged Bird. They are also announcing a new tech in education initiative funded by an anonymous donor." Amelia was silent for a moment. The donor was her. "Richard is going to be there," she said, her voice flat. "He's trying to get on the board." "I know," Julian replied, "which is precisely why you need to be there. It's not about him, Amelia. It's about you stepping into the light. It's time for Aria to make her debut." A slow smile spread across Amelia's face. Julian was right. This wasn't revenge. It was a resurrection, and it deserved to be seen. The grand ballroom of the plaza was a symphony of opulence. Chandeliers dripped crystals like frozen waterfalls, casting a warm, golden glow on the city's elite. Waiters in crisp tuxedos weaved through the crowd with trays of champagne and caviar-topped blinis. The air hummed with the murmur of powerful conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the soft strains of a string quartet. Richard Vance was in his element. He moved through the room with the easy grace of a predator, his hand resting possessively on the small of Tiffany's back. He was a magnet for the city's power brokers. A handshake here with a banking magnate, a shared laugh there with a senator. Tiffany, radiant in her red dress, played her part to perfection, smiling demurely and laughing at all the right moments. "Richard, marvelous to see you," bellowed Marcus Thorne, a portly real estate tycoon. "And this must be the lovely Tiffany. My dear, you are a vision." "Marcus, you old charmer," Richard laughed, clapping him on the back. "Good to see you're still robbing the city blind." The men chuckled. Tiffany blushed prettily. This was the world Richard had wanted, a world of easy camaraderie, built on mutual success and unspoken understandings. Amelia had never understood this kind of networking. She would stand awkwardly in a corner, nursing a single glass of water, her discomfort a palpable embarrassment to him. "So, Richard," Marcus said, lowering his voice, "the board seat, is it in the bag?" "Let's just say I've made a compelling case," Richard said with a confident smirk. "My donation this year was significant, and my vision for the firm's future is something they can't ignore. I heard the centerpiece of the auction tonight is a piece by that new ghost artist, Aria." Marcus's wife, Eleanor, chimed in. "They say it's expected to fetch over $1 million. It's all anyone can talk about." "A flash in the pan," Richard said dismissively, waving a hand as if to swat away the topic. "Digital nonsense. Give me a real painting any day. Something with texture, with history." He glanced around the room, feeling a supreme sense of satisfaction. Everything was perfect. He was respected, feared, and admired. Tiffany was drawing envious glances from other men, and their wives were looking at her with a mixture of disdain and jealousy, the perfect cocktail of social victory. At their table, surrounded by other high-powered couples, the conversation inevitably turned to divorces and new partners. "You're lucky you got out when you did, Richard," said one of his friends, a hedge fund manager named Barry. "I saw your ex-wife at the grocery store a few months back. Lord, she has not aged well. Looked like she'd been dragged through a hedge backward." Richard chuckled, a cruel, easy sound. "The light of ambition went out of that one a long time ago, Barry. Some people are just destined for a quiet, suburban life. Can't fault them for it, I suppose." Tiffany giggled, placing a perfectly manicured hand on his arm. "Ricky was telling me she spends all her time making little drawings on her computer. Isn't that cute?" The table erupted in polite, condescending laughter. It was the perfect narrative. Richard, the dynamic titan of industry, had been held back by his dowdy, unambitious wife. Now, free of his chains, he was soaring to new heights with a woman who matched his sparkle. He basked in their validation, letting it wash over him. It was the story he had told himself, and now, to hear it echoed back at him by his peers, was deeply gratifying. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the expensive scotch in his glass. He scanned the magnificent ballroom, the glittering people, the aura of immense wealth. This was his kingdom. He was the king, and the beautiful woman beside him was his queen. There was nothing and no one who could touch him tonight. The memory of Amelia in the grocery store, looking drab and worn out, only served to heighten his sense of accomplishment. He had escaped. He was free. The main doors of the ballroom began to open, signaling the arrival of a late and likely important guest. Richard paid it no mind. No one could possibly steal the spotlight from him tonight. It began not as a sight, but as a sound. A subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The steady hum of conversation, which had been the ballroom's heartbeat, suddenly faltered. It started near the grand entrance, a ripple of silence that spread outward, turning heads as it went. Voices trailed off mid-sentence. Champagne flutes paused halfway to lips. A collective, unspoken question mark hung in the air. Richard, annoyed by the interruption to his story about a hostile takeover, turned his head with a frown. "What on earth is going on?" he muttered. And then he saw her. For a disorienting second, his brain refused to process the image. The woman standing in the doorway was a stranger, an ethereal vision that didn't belong to his world of calculated transactions and predictable socialites. She was wearing a gown of deep sapphire silk that seemed to drink the light of the chandeliers and reflect it back as a soft, internal glow. The dress was a masterpiece of understated elegance, cut in a way that skimmed her body, hinting at a strength and grace that was both powerful and feminine. Her hair, which he remembered as a non-committal brown, was now a rich chestnut, styled in soft waves that cascaded over one shoulder. A delicate diamond necklace glittered at her throat, its brilliance matched only by the confident light in her eyes. Her face. That was the most shocking part. The tired, sad lines were gone. In their place was a serene confidence. Her cheekbones, which he'd never paid attention to, were sharp and elegant, and her lips, which were usually a pale, thin line, were curved into a small, knowing smile. She wasn't just beautiful. She was breathtaking. She radiated an aura of self-possession that was more captivating than any amount of sequins or diamonds. A confused murmur rippled through the table. "My God, who is that?" Eleanor Thorne whispered, her eyes wide. "Is she a movie star?" Richard didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was dry, his heart hammering against his ribs. Because as the woman took another step into the room, her eyes briefly scanning the crowd, he realized with a jolt of pure, unadulterated shock that he knew her. This stunning, luminous creature was Amelia. His Amelia. The plain, mousy woman he had discarded. The woman he had confidently declared was at home knitting a sweater. It was impossible. It was a hallucination, a trick of the light. But it was undeniably her. Tiffany, sensing the shift in his attention, followed his gaze. Her perfectly painted smile froze, then twisted into a mask of disbelief. "No," she breathed, her voice a harsh whisper. "It can't be." But it was. And she was not alone. At her side, with a hand resting lightly on the small of her back, was Julian Croft. Croft was a legend in the venture capital world, a man who built empires, and whose presence at any event guaranteed media attention. He was handsome in a rugged, intelligent way, and he looked at Amelia with an expression of profound admiration and affection. He leaned in and whispered something in her ear, and Amelia laughed. It was not the quiet, hesitant titter he remembered. It was a full, musical laugh, filled with genuine joy. It was the laugh of a woman who was completely, utterly happy. The sight was a physical blow to Richard. It knocked the air from his lungs. The room, which moments ago had felt like his kingdom, now felt like a tilting, hostile stage. Every eye was on Amelia. The banking magnates, the senators, the socialites. They were all captivated. They weren't just looking, they were staring, their faces a mixture of awe and intrigue. Richard Vance and his scarlet-clad mistress, who had been the center of the universe just a minute before, had completely vanished. They were footnotes in the presence of this new, brilliant star. He watched, paralyzed, as the chairman of the gala, a man Richard had been trying to get a meeting with for 6 months, rushed over to greet Amelia and Julian, kissing her hand as if she were royalty. "This is a joke," Tiffany hissed, her nails digging into Richard's arm. "What is she doing here? And with him? How does she even know Julian Croft?" Richard couldn't answer. His mind was a maelstrom of confusion, rage, and a terrifying, unfamiliar emotion he couldn't immediately name. It was the feeling of a man standing on solid ground one moment and finding himself in a freefall the next. The carefully constructed narrative of his life, his success, his brilliance, his justified decision to leave his boring wife, had just been blown to pieces by a woman in a sapphire dress. The center of gravity in the ballroom had shifted irrevocably. It was now a planet orbiting a new sun. Amelia. People didn't walk to her. They drifted, pulled in by her inexplicable magnetism. Julian Croft, acting as a gentle gatekeeper, introduced her to a select few, his pride in her evident in the way he stood by her side. "Amelia, I'd like you to meet Senator Thompson. Senator, this is my dear friend and business partner, Amelia Vance." The senator, a man known for his gruff demeanor, practically melted, taking Amelia's hand. "Miss Vance, the pleasure is all mine. Julian has told me extraordinary things about your work." "He's far too kind," Amelia replied, her voice calm and steady, with a warmth Richard had forgotten it could possess. From his table, Richard watched the scene with a burning, impotent fury. These were his contacts, his peers. They were supposed to be fawning over him. Instead, they were flocking to his ex-wife, the woman he had assured everyone was a nobody. He felt his status, his very identity in this room, dissolving before his eyes. Tiffany was not handling it well. Her face was tight with fury, her crimson smile a brittle slash. "This is ridiculous. She probably rented that dress. And who knows what she did to get a man like Julian Croft to bring her here." "Be quiet, Tiffany," Richard snapped, his voice a low growl. The last thing he needed was for her to cause a scene. He had to regain control of the situation. He was Richard Vance. He would not be upstaged by his mousy ex-wife, no matter how she was dressed. He stood up, straightening his tie, a mask of cool composure sliding over his face. "I'm going to go say hello. It's the polite thing to do." "Ricky, no!" Tiffany hissed, grabbing his sleeve, but he shook her off. He strode across the floor, each step a conscious effort to project the power and confidence that were rapidly draining out of him. As he approached the circle surrounding Amelia, the conversations quieted. People stepped back, sensing a confrontation. Amelia turned to face him. Up close, the transformation was even more staggering. Her skin was luminous, her eyes clear and direct. There was no trace of the timid, apologetic woman he had known. She looked at him, not with anger or hurt, but with a cool, detached neutrality that was more unnerving than any outburst. "Richard," she said, her tone even, "what a surprise to see you here." "Amelia," he said, forcing a smile that felt like a grimace. "You look different." "I feel different," she replied simply. Julian Croft stepped forward slightly, positioning himself protectively at Amelia's side. He extended a hand to Richard. "Richard Vance, Julian Croft. We haven't been formally introduced." Richard shook his hand, the grip firm and uncompromising. "Croft, I wasn't aware you and Amelia were acquainted." "Amelia is one of the most brilliant minds I've ever had the pleasure of working with," Julian said smoothly, his eyes never leaving Richard's. "A true visionary. You must be incredibly proud of all she's accomplished." The words were a dagger, expertly twisted. Proud? He had been the opposite of proud. He had been dismissive, cruel, and belittling. The senator and the others in the circle were watching him, their expressions unreadable. He had to say something, reassert his dominance. "Well, she always had her little hobbies," Richard said, trying for a tone of fond condescension. "I'm glad to see she's found a way to occupy her time." The air grew thick with tension. The insult hung there, clumsy and pathetic. Amelia didn't even flinch. She just held his gaze, a flicker of something that might have been pity in her eyes. It was Julian who responded, his voice dangerously soft. "Her little hobby, as you call it, is about to revolutionize 3 different industries. But I'm sure you have more important things to discuss." He turned his back on Richard, a clear and public dismissal, and guided Amelia toward another group of guests. Richard stood there, frozen, as the circle reformed around Amelia, leaving him on the outside. He was invisible. He could hear the whispers starting up around him, see the sideways glances. His attempt to put Amelia in her place had backfired spectacularly, making him look petty and foolish. He retreated to his table, his face a thunderous mask. Tiffany was waiting, her expression a mixture of fear and fury. "What happened?" she demanded. "Nothing," he bit out, slumping into his chair and grabbing his scotch. He drained the glass in one gulp. The smooth, expensive liquor burned his throat, but did nothing to quell the fire of humiliation in his gut. He was no longer the king in his castle. He was a jester in someone else's court, and the whole world was watching. The night was still young, and he had a terrifying premonition that his humiliation was only just beginning. The dinner portion of the evening was an exercise in torture for Richard. Every time he looked up from his plate of meticulously arranged food, he saw Amelia. She was seated at the chairman's table, laughing, engaging in animated conversation, looking completely at ease. She was a celestial body, and everyone else, including him, was just a piece of space debris caught in her orbit. His own table was cloaked in an awkward silence, the previous easy banter replaced with strained small talk. Barry, the hedge fund manager, avoided his eyes, while Eleanor Thorne kept stealing glances at Amelia, her expression one of bewildered admiration. Finally, the plates were cleared, and the auction began. The auctioneer, a charismatic man with a silver tongue, worked his way through the opening items: a week-long stay at a private villa in Tuscany, a set of diamond earrings from Tiffany & Co. Richard flinched at the name. A walk-on role in a blockbuster movie. The bidding was brisk, the paddles of the wealthy flying up with practiced ease. Richard saw his chance. This was a world he understood. Money was power. He could re-establish his dominance here. He bid aggressively on the Tuscany trip, winning it with a final bid that was $20,000 over its value. He shot a triumphant look across the room, but Amelia wasn't even watching. She was listening intently to something Julian was saying. Then, the auctioneer's voice took on a new, reverent tone. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, for our centerpiece item. An item we are incredibly honored to present. From the enigmatic, groundbreaking artist who has taken the world by storm, we present the Uncaged Bird by the one and only Aria." A hushed awe fell over the ballroom as 2 assistants wheeled a large, high-definition digital screen onto the stage. An image materialized on the screen, and the room collectively gasped. It was a masterpiece. The image depicted a bird made of what looked like shattered stained glass, each shard a kaleidoscope of brilliant color, taking flight from a broken, rusted cage. But as you looked closer, you realized the bird wasn't made of glass. It was made of complex, swirling, fractal patterns, constantly shifting and evolving, giving the illusion of movement, of life. It was a piece of art that was alive. It was beautiful, tragic, and intensely powerful. It spoke of confinement and a glorious, explosive liberation. The artist, Aria, has donated this unique, generative piece to the foundation, the auctioneer announced. It is a one-of-a-kind work whose algorithm ensures the patterns will never repeat themselves in the lifetime of the universe. We will start the bidding at $250,000. Paddles shot up instantly. $300,000. $350,000. $400,000. The price climbed with breathtaking speed. Richard watched, his fists clenched. He hated the art. He hated its pretentious title and its digital gimmickry. Most of all, He hated the way the entire room was mesmerized by it. This aria was stealing his thunder, just as Amelia had. 700,000, called out a tech billionaire from across the room. 750,000, countered an oil heiress. A reckless, dangerous idea began to form in Richard's mind. Winning this bid would be the ultimate power move. It would show everyone that he was still the most important man in the room. He would buy this ridiculous piece of art and prove that he could own anything, control anything, even the very thing that had captivated them all. It would be a way to reclaim the spotlight, to put Amelia and her new friends back in their place. $1 million, Richard said, his voice ringing out in the suddenly quiet room. His paddle was held high and steady. A wave of murmurs washed over the crowd. All eyes turned to him. He felt a thrill of his old power return. He had their attention again. The tech billionaire looked thoughtful for a moment, then slowly lowered his paddle, shaking his head with a smile. The oil heiress shrugged and conceded. $1 million, the auctioneer repeated, his voice filled with excitement. Do I hear 1 million, 100,000? Going once, going twice. Richard's heart swelled with arrogant pride. He had won. He had silenced the room and asserted his dominance with the sheer force of his wealth. He glanced at Amelia. She was watching him now, her expression completely unreadable. Sold! The auctioneer cried, slamming his gavel down. For $1 million to Mr. Richard Vance. A round of applause broke out. Richard stood up and gave a small, magnanimous bow. He felt Tiffany's hand squeeze his under the table, her earlier anger replaced by renewed adoration. He had proven himself. He was still the king. An incredible moment of generosity from Mr. Vance, the auctioneer boomed. And now, for a very special surprise. The reclusive aria has broken her anonymity for one night only to be with us, and to personally thank the winning bidder. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage the brilliant artist behind The Uncaged Bird. Richard's smile was cemented on his face. He prepared himself to be gracious, to shake the hand of this mysterious artist and show everyone how a true patron of the arts behaves. The auctioneer paused for dramatic effect, his voice dropping to a near whisper as a spotlight swept across the room. The beam traveled over the stunned faces of the guests, past Richard's own table, and came to a stop, bathing the chairman's table in a brilliant, unforgiving white light. It landed directly on one person. Please welcome Ms. Amelia Vance. The world stopped. For Richard, sound ceased to exist. The gasp that swept the ballroom, the thunderous applause that followed, the booming voice of the auctioneer, it was all a distant, meaningless hum. The only thing he could process was the image before him, the spotlight, a harsh, interrogating beam fixed on his ex-wife. Amelia. Amelia is Aria. The 4 words crashed through his mind, not as a thought, but as a physical impact. They shattered his reality, his arrogance, his entire self-conception into a million jagged pieces. The doodle hobby, the little drawings, the unambitious woman who was content to live in the shadows. It was all a lie he had constructed and told himself over and over until it became his truth. He watched, numb and disconnected from his own body, as Amelia stood up. She smoothed down the front of her sapphire gown, a picture of grace and composure. Julian Croft and the gala's chairman also stood, applauding her with genuine warmth. She gave them a small, grateful smile before turning and walking toward the stage. Every eye in the room was on her, and then, inevitably, they flickered to him. He could feel the weight of their hundreds of gazes. He was no longer the victor, the generous patron. He was the punchline, the colossal, arrogant fool, the man who had mocked, dismissed, and discarded a genius, only to then pay $1 million for a piece of her soul. The humiliation was a physical sensation, a hot, searing wave that crawled up his neck and set his face on fire. He could see the dawning comprehension on the faces of his peers, the pity in Eleanor Thorne's eyes, the barely concealed smirk on Barry's face. They all knew. They remembered his condescending remarks from just a few hours earlier. They were all connecting the dots, and the picture they formed was of his utter and complete idiocy. On stage, Amelia accepted the microphone. She looked out at the crowd, her gaze calm and unwavering. When her eyes met his, there was no malice, no triumph. There was only a quiet finality, a closing of a door. "Thank you," she began, her voice clear and resonant, filling the silent ballroom. "Thank you to the Starlight Foundation for the incredible work you do. I created The Uncaged Bird during a time of profound personal change. It's about the moment you realize the cage you've been in was never locked. The door was always open. It's about having the courage to remember your own wings and to finally fly." Her words were a direct hit, a public vivisection of their life together, performed with surgical precision and not a single drop of overt venom. She didn't need to name him. Everyone in the room understood. He was the cage. "I am deeply moved," she continued, her gaze shifting to the check being presented, "that this piece has raised so much for a cause so dear to my heart. And I am especially thankful to the winning bidder." She paused, and for a terrifying second, Richard thought she would point him out. But she didn't. She was classier than that. "Your generosity tonight will help countless young artists and innovators find their own wings. Thank you." The ballroom erupted in a standing ovation. The applause was deafening, a roar of approval, not just for her art, but for her story, for her incredible, public resurrection. Richard remained seated, a stone statue in a sea of adulation for the woman he had thrown away. Tiffany was tugging at his sleeve, her face a pale mask of horror. "Ricky," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Ricky, what is happening?" He couldn't answer. He was trapped in the wreckage of his own making. He had built his entire life on the foundation of his superiority over Amelia. He had defined his success by her failure, his brilliance by her simplicity. And in one stunning, perfectly executed moment, she had demolished that foundation, leaving him buried in the rubble. He looked at the image on the screen, the bird made of light, soaring from its broken cage. He finally understood its title. He had thought he was the one who had escaped. But he had been wrong. He was the cage, rusted and empty, left behind on the ground while she soared into the stratosphere. The $1 million wasn't a purchase. It was a penance. The price he had to pay to watch his own world burn. The ovation for Amelia eventually subsided, but the atmosphere in the ballroom remained electric. Amelia didn't return to her seat. Instead, the chairman of the Starlight Foundation, Mr. Davenport, remained on stage with her, his arm linked through hers in a gesture of solidarity. Amelia, has done more than just grace us with her art tonight," Davenport announced, his voice booming with authority. "As some of you know, the Vance Endicott firm has long been a supporter of this foundation. We have been looking to fill a vacant seat on our board with someone who represents the future, not the past. Someone with vision, integrity, and a deep understanding of the intersection between technology and art." Richard sat bolt upright. This was it. Despite the humiliation, this was the moment he'd been waiting for, the validation he so desperately needed. He had paid his $1,000,000 penance. Surely they would recognize his power, his commitment. Therefore, Davenport continued, it is my distinct honor to announce the new member of our board of directors, Mr. Julian Croft. Another wave of applause, more polite this time, but still decisive. Richard felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. Croft? They had chosen Croft over him? He looked at Julian, who stood and gave a nod of acknowledgement, his eyes finding Amelia's in a shared look of triumph. It was a coordinated attack. A coup. But Davenport wasn't finished. Furthermore, in partnership with our new board member, the Starlight Foundation is thrilled to announce our largest ever educational initiative. Project ARIA will provide scholarships and cutting-edge technology developed by Amelia Vance's own company to underprivileged students across the country. This program is made possible by a landmark, 8-figure anonymous donation that was finalized just this afternoon. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The anonymous donor was Amelia. The new board member was her partner. Her company was now the centerpiece of the foundation's future. She hadn't just come here to reveal herself. She had come to take over his world. Whispers were now erupting all around him, no longer subtle. They were pointed and sharp. Did you hear? Vance Endicott is doing an internal audit. Something about Richard's expense accounts. Heard he leveraged everything for that new venture with his girlfriend. Julian Croft never makes a move without a reason. He must know something. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from his partner at the firm. We need to talk. Now. The SEC has been in touch. The blood drained from Richard's face. He felt cold, clammy. The money he'd funneled to Tiffany, the creative accounting he'd used to fund their lifestyle. He'd been so sure he'd covered his tracks. But a man like Julian Croft, doing his due diligence before joining a board so closely tied to Richard's firm, would have found the cracks. He wouldn't just find them. He would exploit them. Tiffany, finally grasping the magnitude of the disaster, was starting to panic. "Ricky, what's going on? What are they saying?" Her voice was shrill, attracting more unwanted attention. "Shut up!" he hissed, his voice trembling with a rage born of pure terror. He looked up and saw Amelia, standing at the side of the stage, talking quietly with Senator Thompson. She looked serene, powerful, and completely in control. She hadn't laid a hand on him, hadn't said a single cruel word. She had simply become herself, and in doing so, had exposed him for the hollow, fraudulent man he was. His downfall was not her revenge. It was merely a consequence of her success. He couldn't breathe. The opulent ballroom felt like a tomb. He had to get out. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He grabbed Tiffany's arm, his grip painfully tight, and began pulling her through the crowd. People parted before him, their faces a mixture of pity and contempt. He didn't look back. He couldn't bear to see the kingdom he had lost, the woman who had risen from the ashes he had left her in. As he stumbled out of the grand ballroom and into the cold, indifferent night, he knew he had lost more than a board seat or $1,000,000. He had lost his past, his future, and the carefully crafted illusion of his own greatness. He was left with nothing but the shrill whining of the woman beside him and the bitter, suffocating dust of his ruined empire. Amelia watched him go, a single, sad thought passing through her mind. The cage had been for both of them. The only difference was, she had found the courage to fly. 6 months after the Starlight Gala, the city was draped in the crisp, bright colors of spring. From her corner office on the 47th floor, Amelia Vance had a panoramic view of the sprawling metropolis below. The office was a testament to her new life, minimalist, filled with light, and decorated with a single, stunning digital canvas on the wall that cycled through serene, generative landscapes of her own design. The quiet hum of her company, Aria Innovations, was a comforting sound from beyond her glass door. It was the sound of creation, of progress, of a future she was building on her own terms. She took a sip of her morning tea, her eyes scanning a news article on her tablet. The headline was stark. Richard Vance declares bankruptcy amidst SEC fraud investigation. The article detailed the complete implosion of his life. Fired from his firm in disgrace, facing serious federal charges, and abandoned by Tiffany the moment his credit cards were declined. The penthouse, the Bentley, the collection of real art, all had been liquidated to pay off a mountain of debt and legal fees. A grainy paparazzi photo showed him leaving a courthouse, his face grey and haggard, a shrunken figure in an ill-fitting suit. He looked like a ghost. A younger Amelia would have felt a storm of emotions, anger, pity, perhaps even a twisted sense of satisfaction. But the woman she was now felt only a profound, quiet stillness. Richard's fate was a story that no longer involved her. It was the logical conclusion to a life built on arrogance and shortcuts. He hadn't been a victim of her success. He was a casualty of his own character. Her daughter, Clara, walked in, placing a file on her desk. She glanced at the tablet in Amelia's hands. "I saw that," Clara said softly, her expression gentle. "Are you okay?" Amelia looked up and smiled, a genuine, untroubled smile. "I am, completely. It feels like reading about a stranger." She closed the tablet, dismissing the article and the man in it from her thoughts. "What do you have for me?" "The first round of Project Aria scholarship recipients," Clara said, her own face lighting up with passion. "Mum, these kids are incredible. There's a girl from the Bronx who taught herself to code using library computers. A boy from rural Ohio who builds robots out of spare parts. Their applications, their art, it's breathtaking." Amelia opened the file, her heart swelling with a purpose that felt more real and satisfying than any applause in a ballroom. This was the true reward. This was the legacy she was building. Not one of revenge, but of opportunity. She was turning the pain of her past into a brighter future for others. Later that afternoon, Julian Croft stopped by. Their partnership had blossomed into a deep and trusting friendship, a relationship built on mutual respect and shared vision. "I saw the news about Richard," he said, standing by the large window, his hands in his pockets. "A messy end." "An inevitable one," Amelia corrected gently. She stood beside him, and together they looked out at the endless horizon. The city below seemed small, a map of possibilities. "I've been working on a new piece," she said, changing the subject to something that mattered. "It's different from The Uncaged Bird. Less about the escape, more about the journey after." "What's it called?" Julian asked, turning to look at her, his eyes warm with admiration. Amelia smiled, a flicker of creative excitement dancing in her own eyes. "It's called Horizons, because for the first time, I feel like I can see forever." She had not only reclaimed her life, she had built a new one, grander and more beautiful than she had ever dared to imagine. The plain, mousy wife was a distant memory, a character from a story that was over. In her place stood Aria, an artist, a CEO, a philanthropist, a woman who had learned that the only canvas that truly mattered was the one on which you painted your own future. And hers was vast, brilliant, and filled with light. And so, Amelia's story isn't about the dress, the money, or the public humiliation of a man who deserved it. It's about the quiet, unshakable power of rediscovering your own worth. Richard saw Amelia as a reflection of himself, and when he decided she was plain, he tried to make her so. But he could never extinguish the fire within her. He could only temporarily hide it. Her triumph reminds us that the most powerful transformations happen when we stop living for someone else's approval and start creating a life that is a masterpiece of our own design. She didn't just walk into a gala. She walked back into her own power, proving that the best revenge is not a loud explosion, but the quiet, undeniable brilliance of a life well lived. If Amelia's journey from the shadows into the spotlight moved you, please let us know in the comments. What part of her story resonated with you the most? Don't forget to hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded of their own strength, and subscribe for more stories of justice and empowerment. Your support helps us bring these incredible tales to life. Thank you for listening.